Amara's hands moved through the steam rising from the espresso machine, creating swirling patterns in the air as she prepared another overpriced latte. Monday morning at the Echo Lounge meant a parade of designer suits and dismissive glances, people who looked through her as if she were as transparent as the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city skyline. She'd learned to exist in their peripheral vision, efficient, invisible, forgettable. "Table for needs a refill," Marcus barked from across the counter, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of clinking cups and muted conversations. "And table 7 just sat down. Go take her order." Before we dive into the story, please subscribe, like and share. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell. Amara wiped her hands on her apron and grabbed her notepad, weaving between tables with the practiced grace of someone who'd learned to navigate spaces that barely acknowledged her existence. She approached table 7 with her professional smile already in place, but the words died on her lips when she saw the woman sitting there. She was striking in that effortless way that spoke of old money and quiet confidence, silver hair swept into an elegant knot, a silk scarf the color of deep water draped across her shoulders, pearl earrings catching the morning light. But it was her hands that captured Amara's attention. They were moving, fluid and purposeful, forming shapes in the air with a desperate kind of hope. The woman was signing. "Coffee, please. Black." Amara's heart stuttered. Around them, other waiters had paused, confusion flickering across their faces as they watched the woman's hands move through incomprehensible gestures. Someone whispered something about that deaf lady again, their tone hovering between pity and irritation. Without thinking, Amara's hands responded. "Of course. Would you like anything to eat?" The transformation was instantaneous. The woman's eyes, a warm brown that reminded Amara of her father's, widened with shock, then filled with tears. Her hands flew to her chest, pressing against her heart, before moving again with trembling urgency. "You understand me?" "Yes," Amara signed, smiling despite the curious stares from other customers. "My father was deaf. I grew up signing." The woman covered her mouth, shoulders shaking with silent emotion. When she lowered her hands, her smile was incandescent, transforming her entire face. "I've been coming here for months. You're the first person who's ever understood." "I'm Amara," she signed. "And I'm sorry no one understood you before." "Margaret," the woman signed back. "And you have nothing to apologize for. This is the kindest thing that's happened to me in a long time." For the next 20 minutes, Amara found herself returning to table 7 between other orders, stealing moments to converse in sign language while the café pulsed with its usual chaotic rhythm. Margaret asked about her father, about how Amara had learned to sign, about what it was like to carry a language most of the world couldn't understand. Amara asked about Margaret's morning, about her favorite kind of coffee, about the book she had tucked into her designer handbag. They talked about everything and nothing, their hands creating entire conversations in the spaces between espresso shots and delivered orders. Other customers snapped their fingers impatiently, executives checked their watches with exaggerated sighs, but Amara couldn't bring herself to rush away from the first genuine connection she'd felt in months. "You're spending a lot of time at table 7, Sarah whispered when Amara returned to the counter. "Marcus is going to notice." She needed help ordering, Amara said, preparing Margaret's coffee with extra care. "That's Margaret Hale," Sarah continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Ethan Hale's mother. You know, the billionaire who owns this building? Owns half the city? That Ethan Hale." Amara's hand stilled over the coffee cup. She'd seen the name on paychecks, had glimpsed his face in business magazines scattered throughout the lobby, all sharp jawlines and calculated intensity, the kind of man who measured success in acquired properties and quarterly earnings. She'd never connected him to the elegant woman signing at table 7. "She comes in every week," Sarah added. "Always sits alone. I've never seen her talk to anyone before." When Amara delivered the coffee, Margaret was writing something on a small piece of paper. She slid it across the table along with a $100 bill. The note read, "Thank you for seeing me. Not as Ethan Hale's mother. Not as the deaf woman who can't order coffee. Just as Margaret. Thank you for that gift." "It wasn't a gift," Amara signed. It was just conversation. Please come back. I will, Margaret promised, her hands moving with renewed energy. Every day, if you'll have me. What Amara didn't know, couldn't have known, was that 50 floors above, in an office of glass and steel and carefully controlled temperature, Ethan Hale was reviewing security footage from the café. He did this periodically, a habit born from the obsessive attention to detail that had built his empire. Usually, the footage was mundane, customers coming and going, staff performing their duties with varying degrees of competence, the mechanical rhythm of commerce. But today, something caught his attention. His mother sat at table 7, her face transformed by a smile he hadn't seen in years. And the waitress, young, black, moving with quiet confidence, was signing with her. Actual sign language. Their hands moved in rapid conversation, creating entire worlds of meaning that the security cameras captured but couldn't translate. Ethan watched the footage 3 times, his jaw tightening with each replay. His mother laughed, actually laughed, at something the waitress signed. She leaned forward, engaged, alive in a way that made something uncomfortable twist in his chest. He closed the laptop with more force than necessary, the click echoing through his empty office. The next morning, Margaret returned. And the morning after that. Within a week, it had become a ritual. Amara would see her settle at table 7, and something in her own chest would settle too, as if she'd been holding her breath and could finally exhale. They developed a shorthand, a private language within a language. Margaret would arrive, and Amara would sign, the usual. Margaret would respond with please, and they'd smile at the simplicity of being understood. During slow moments, Amara would slip into the seat across from Margaret, and they'd talk about books, about the changing seasons visible through the massive windows, about Margaret's garden and the tomatoes that refused to ripen. Tell me about your father, Margaret signed one afternoon, her expression gentle but curious. Amara's hand slowed, forming words heavy with memory. He was a teacher. Taught deaf children for 30 years. He said the world was always trying to make deaf people smaller, quieter, less visible. He spent his life making sure his students knew they were already whole. He sounds remarkable. He was. Amara paused, then continued. He died 3 years ago. Stroke. By the time I got to the hospital, he was already gone. I never got to say goodbye properly. Asterisk. Margaret reached across the table and squeezed Amara's hand. No signs, no words, just the pressure of palm against palm, the universal language of shared grief. I'm sorry, Margaret signed when they pulled apart. Loss makes the world quieter, doesn't it? Yes, Amara agreed. Even for those of us who can hear. One Tuesday, Margaret arrived with an old photograph tucked into a leather album. She waited until Amara had a free moment, then slid it across the table. The image showed a young boy, maybe 7 or 8, his hands frozen mid-sign, his face split by a gap-toothed grin. Beside him stood a younger Margaret, her hands mirroring his gesture in perfect synchronicity. My son, Margaret signed, her movement slower than usual. This was taken at his school's Deaf Awareness Day. He'd been learning to sign since he was 3. Amara studied the photograph, noting the joy radiating from the boy's face, the pride evident in Margaret's posture. He looks happy. He was. Margaret's hands trembled slightly. Until my husband decided it was inappropriate. Said it made Ethan look weak, made our family look like we were catering to disability. He forbade the signing. Said Ethan needed to focus on becoming a man who could command respect, not one who spoke with his hands. And Ethan stopped. Margaret nodded, her eyes distant. He was 8. He wanted his father's approval so badly. So he buried the signing, buried that part of himself. Within a year, we couldn't communicate anymore. He'd look at me when I signed and his face would just close off, like I was speaking a language he'd chosen to forget. That must have been devastating. It was like losing him twice. Margaret signed. Once to his father's ambitions, and once to the silence that grew between us. He's a stranger now. A successful, brilliant stranger who's forgotten how to listen. Amara reached for Margaret's hand again, holding it gently. I'm sorry. Don't be. Margaret managed a weak smile. You've given me more conversation in these past weeks than I've had in years. That's something. That evening, as Amara was cleaning the last tables, Marcus appeared at her elbow, his expression unreadable. Mr. Hale wants to see you. Top floor. Don't keep him waiting. Her stomach dropped. Did I do something wrong? How should I know? Just go. The elevator ride to the 50th floor felt eternal. The doors opened onto a reception area that looked like it had been designed to intimidate, all sharp angles and muted grays, the kind of space where warmth went to die. A woman in a severe black suit gestured toward double doors that probably cost more than Amara's annual salary. Ethan Hale stood with his back to her, staring out at the city spread below like a conquered kingdom. When he turned, Amara understood why people described him as formidable. Everything about him was controlled, his posture military straight, his expression carefully neutral, his expensive suit fitting like armor. Sit, he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. Amara sat, her hands clasped in her lap to keep them from shaking. You've taken an interest in my mother, he said. Not a question, not quite an accusation, but something hovering between the two. She's a regular customer, Amara replied, keeping her voice steady. I'm just doing my job. Your job is to serve coffee and clear tables. Not to, he paused, searching for words. Not to insert yourself into personal matters. I haven't inserted myself into anything. Your mother and I have conversations. That's all. Conversations in sign language. Yes. Why? The question came out sharper than he'd probably intended. Amara met his gaze directly. Because she was signing to me. Because my father was deaf and I grew up learning ASL. Because when someone communicates with you, the decent thing to do is communicate back. It's not complicated, Mr. Hale. His jaw tightened. My mother doesn't need your pity. The words ignited something in Amara's chest. She stood, her chair scraping against the polished floor. With respect, sir, your mother doesn't need your permission either. She's a grown woman who's been coming to that cafe for months, hoping someone would understand her. All I've done is treat her like a human being instead of an inconvenience. You don't know anything about? I know she lights up when someone signs with her. I know she told me about a little boy who used to speak her language before he decided it wasn't worth his time. I know that's not pity, Mr. Hale. That's just basic human decency, something your security cameras apparently can't capture. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. They stared at each other across the expanse of his desk, the city glittering indifferently behind him. You're dismissed, he finally said, turning back to the window. Amara left without another word, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. If you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us create more content that matters. 2 weeks later, everything changed. Amara was carrying a tray stacked with orders when she heard the crash. Customers jumped from their seats near table 7, forming a semicircle around something on the floor. Someone screamed. Someone else yelled for help. Amara dropped the tray, ceramic shattering across marble as she ran. Margaret lay on the floor, her body rigid, one hand clutched to her chest. Her eyes were wide with terror and pain, her free hand moving frantically, trying to communicate something that no one else could understand. Call an ambulance, someone shouted. Is she having a seizure? Someone do something. Amara dropped to her knees, glass from her broken tray cutting through her uniform, and grabbed Margaret's hand. Where does it hurt? She signed with her free hand, keeping her movements visible despite the chaos. Chest, Margaret signed weakly. Can't breathe. Crushing. She's having a heart attack. Amara screamed to the crowd. Someone call 911 now. She held Margaret's hand, signing reassurances while simultaneously shouting instructions to the gathering crowd. Stay with me. Help is coming. Keep breathing. You're going to be okay. The paramedics arrived within 6 minutes that felt like hours. They loaded Margaret onto a stretcher, attaching monitors, asking questions that Margaret couldn't answer. Amara climbed into the ambulance without asking permission, translating every sign, every gesture, every desperate attempt Margaret made to explain the crushing pressure in her chest and the numbness spreading down her left arm. At the hospital, Amara stood outside the emergency room in her coffee-stained uniform, her hand still shaking from adrenaline, translating for nurses and doctors who fired questions faster than she could process. Margaret's vitals. Her medical history. Her medications. Her allergies. Every answer came through Amara's hands. An hour later, Ethan Hale burst through the emergency room doors like a force of nature. His tie was loose, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his eyes wild with something that looked dangerously close to panic. He pushed past nurses and orderlies until he found Margaret's room. Amara stood in the hallway, invisible again, watching through the window as Ethan stood frozen at his mother's bedside. Margaret's eyes were closed, her chest rising and falling with mechanical regularity, monitored by machines that beeped out the rhythm of her survival. He reached toward her, then stopped, his hand hovering in the space between connection and distance. He stood there for 20 minutes, unable to bridge that final gap. When he emerged, his face was ashen. He saw Amara and stopped, something cracking in his carefully maintained armor. "The doctor said you saved her life," he said, his voice rough. "They said you knew exactly what to tell them. That your translations gave them the information they needed to stabilize her. I just translated what she was saying. I couldn't understand her." The admission seemed to cost him something. "My own mother was in pain, terrified, and I couldn't understand what she was trying to tell anyone. I stood there useless while a stranger," his voice broke. "You could talk to her and I couldn't." Amara took a step closer. "Mr. Hale." "I used to sign," he said suddenly, the words tumbling out like a confession. "When I was a kid. Every day. My father hated it. Said it made me look weak, made our family look like we were accommodating disability instead of overcoming it. He wanted a son who could command a boardroom, who could close deals and intimidate competitors. Not one who spoke with his hands like." He stopped, jaw clenched. "So I stopped. I buried it. And now she's in there, and I can't even tell her I'm sorry." "It's not too late," Amara said softly. "You can learn again." He laughed bitterly. "I've spent 30 years building walls between us. 30 years choosing my father's approval over my mother's love. How do I tear those walls down now? One sign at a time. One word at a time. The same way they were built, gradually, with intention." He stared at her, this woman who'd shown his mother more compassion in a few weeks than he'd managed in years. "Would you teach me?" "Why should I?" The question caught him off guard. What? You accused me of pitying your mother. Of inserting myself where I didn't belong. You looked at me like I was a problem to be solved. Why should I help you now?" He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because she deserves better than a son who forgot how to listen. And because I'm asking, really asking, for help. Please." Amara studied his face, seeing past the expensive suit and practiced authority to the frightened boy in that photograph, the one who'd chosen silence over connection. "Okay," she finally said. "But not for you. For her." Over the next 3 weeks, they met in a small conference room after the café closed. Amara taught him the basics, the alphabet, simple phrases, the grammatical structure of ASL that his hands slowly remembered. He was rusty, his movements stiff from decades of disuse, but he practiced with an intensity that bordered on obsession. "Why do you do this?" he asked one evening, his hands tired from signing the same phrase repeatedly. "Why help me?" "Because Margaret showed me a picture of a little boy who used to speak her language," Amara said, demonstrating another sign. "And I think that version of you is still in there, buried under 30 years of silence and your father's expectations. He's just been quiet for too long. What if it's too late?" What if I've broken something that can't be fixed? Then you'll know you tried. But staying silent? That's a guarantee of nothing changing. He nodded slowly, then returned to practicing, his hands forming words that had once been as natural as breathing. 3 weeks after her collapse, Margaret came home from the hospital. Ethan stood outside her brownstone, the house he'd bought her but rarely visited, trying to convince his feet to carry him up the front steps. His hands were sweating. The phrase Amara had made him practice 100 times played over and over in his mind. He knocked. Waited. Knocked again. Margaret opened the door, surprise flickering across her face. She gestured for him to come in, moving to the living room where afternoon light fell across her favorite chair like a benediction. They sat across from each other, the space between them filled with years of accumulated silence. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. His hands shook as he raised them, forming the words Amara had taught him, the words he should have said decades ago. I'm sorry. The signs were clumsy, unpracticed, his fingers stumbling over shapes they'd once known intimately. But they were clear enough. Margaret's hands flew to her mouth. Tears spilled down her cheeks, catching the afternoon light. She stared at him, this stranger who was her son, this son who'd been a stranger, as if seeing him for the first time in 30 years. Then her hands moved, trembling but certain. I hear you. Ethan began to cry then, decades of carefully maintained control shattering. He moved to kneel beside her chair, and she pulled him into an embrace that smelled like lavender and forgiveness. When they pulled apart, his hands were already moving, asking questions, sharing apologies, bridging the canyon that had yawned between them for so long. They talked for 3 hours. He told her about the pressure, the expectations, the way his father had systematically dismantled every soft part of him until only the ruthless businessman remained. She told him about the loneliness, the silence that had filled her days, the way she'd watched him transform into someone she couldn't reach. I missed you, he signed, the words coming easier now. I was always here, she signed back. You just couldn't see me. I see you now, he promised. And I won't look away again. Outside the window, Amara stood on the sidewalk, a bouquet of flowers in her hands. She'd planned to drop them off, to check on Margaret, but seeing them through the window, mother and son, finally speaking the same language, she decided not to interrupt. She set the flowers on the doorstep and walked away, smiling to herself. Behind her, the city lights flickered on one by one, and somewhere a neon sign buzzed to life, Echo Lounge. For months later, Amara arrived for her morning shift to find Ethan standing awkwardly near the espresso machine, looking like a man who owned the building but rarely descended to experience it. I wanted to thank you, he said. Properly. You already did. I didn't. He handed her an envelope. My mother and I started a foundation. Teaching ASL to families, promoting deaf awareness in corporate spaces, building communication bridges. This is a scholarship, full ride to any university you choose, plus a job offer to help run the foundation's outreach programs. If you're interested. Amara opened the envelope, her eyes widening. This is, I can't. You can and you should. You gave me back my mother. This doesn't even begin to cover that debt. He paused, something like a real smile crossing his face. She's waiting at table 7. She wanted to ask you in person. Amara found Margaret there, exactly where this had all begun. When Margaret saw her, her hands moved in greeting, then in invitation. Join me? Always, Amara signed back, sliding into the seat across from her. Margaret reached across the table, pressing the scholarship letter between Amara's hands. This is just the beginning, she signed. We want to create programs in every major city. ASL classes, deaf awareness training, accessibility consulting. We want you to help us build it. Why me? Because you saw me when no one else did. Because you treated my language like a gift instead of a barrier. Because the world needs more people who know how to listen. Amara looked down at the letter, then back at Margaret's expectant face, at Ethan watching from across the café with something like hope in his expression. She thought about her father, about the lifetime he'd spent teaching deaf children they were already whole. She thought about the power of being understood, of speaking a language that most of the world couldn't hear. Yes, she signed. I'm in. They sat together as the cafe hummed around them, two women from completely different worlds who'd found each other across barriers of class and circumstance, connected by a language older than words. Around them, life continued its chaotic rhythm, but at table 7, there was only understanding. Sometimes the loudest things are said without words. Sometimes a simple conversation changes everything. If this story moved you, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and hit that like button. Stories like this remind us that connection transcends every barrier, we just have to be willing to listen. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for being here, and thank you for choosing empathy.